Hi, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to this class of biblical exegesis. Another word, interpretation of Bible. Okay, we are going to continue with our lesson on the topic of context and text, which are two key elements in understanding and making that interpretation of Bible or any other text that would be ancient. The reason that we look at the text and context, because the text that we have today as a Bible, whether it's in English, whether it's in Chinese, Korean, they are actually the translation of old script or manuscript, which were written as far as like 3,000 plus years ago. And the nearest would be almost 2,000 years ago. So that means you have to kind of go back to the situation or context where the text or the document of Bible is written. So it is important to understand what the text is, what the context is, before we try to go back to that original text and to the original context to be able to interpret the to make an accurate interpretation of your text. All the texts that we are seeing in the Bible are written within the context of where that author is in, which is way past and which is way different from the context I or you are in. Which means it takes a lot of work to try to go back. It's like I told you, it's like a time machine. You take a time machine and go back. We cannot do that actually. There hasn't been that invention yet. So it takes a lot of work and sometimes guesswork. But since this interpretation or exegesis is a science, at the same time it is an art, but it is science. So you have to rely on the evidence and proof and facts. So any interpretation, biblical interpretation, is not just the guesswork or spontaneous ideas. Sometimes people think that's an interpretation, but that is not. Or your personal and emotional response to the text, that's not the interpretation that we are looking at. Our interpretation should be based on the facts, on the documents, on the proof, on the evidences. So to do so, it takes some research, a lot of hard work, to be able to go back to that original text and the context. Fortunately, there has been a lot of whole tons and tons of works done by very diligent scholars who were studying the Bible, the text, all his or her life. So thus, we have a lot of good material that we can utilize these days. Much of those knowledge, the body of knowledge, has been proven. It's been tested throughout the years with the many different scholars. So we believe it to be true. So we use those documents, those books, those materials to understand the text and the context of Bible. Okay, going back to the topic of culture as context, we have seen the existence as context. So that's existence, and then again the reality as a context. We are going to do the short review. So reality, people, culture, history, society, and ecology, which makes the reality that surrounds us. That is our context. Same thing like 2,000, 3,000 years ago. They had their people around them. They have their own culture. They had their narrative history, and they had their society, which is quite different from ours today, and they had a different ecology. Most of the document text in the Bible is written in the arid, dry weather, which is quite different from what you may know. Anyway, that's the reality. So people, culture, society, history, and ecology, these things make up the context that we are in. Same thing in 1,000 years ago, but much different. On an existence. Existence means how you, as a person, as a people, interact with your reality as the time goes by. So that creates your existence. In other words, it's life. So your life that goes on day by day, that's your existence. It's a human existence. And human existence that deals with a given reality, it's life. And the life involves quite a few different elements. For example, politics, religion, and economy. You have to deal with the money and material, and education, health, media these days. They didn't have much media in that time, but they had a different media than ours, like a narrative spoken by some of the leaders, and you listen and you memorize. So that's the sort of media they have. And then sports and arts, also science, technology, race and ethnic issues, and entertainments. These are what makes your life, human life. So human life has all these different aspects. The reason that we are seeing this existence as context is because several thousand years ago, they still had all these things, politics, technology of their own, even if it's different from our technology today. They had their own way of entertainment. Not only they had these things comes into the Bible as they write their text. People think the Bible is only about prayer and the worship and rituals and these religious elements. No, that's not true. It involves all aspects of human life. That's why the Bible is relevant to us even today. So it's much more than religious scripture. Now we are going into this culture as context. The culture, all human beings live in a culture. You cannot deny your culture. Even if you go into an island by yourself, like a Robinson Crusoe, he had created his own culture in that small tiny island that he was shipwrecked. So culture is relevant to every person, and there's no way that you can avoid or live without a culture. And in this culture, these are the elements that we consider as we examine the cultural context in the Bible. So as we read the text, try to interpret that text. Not only you read the text, from the text, you are trying to make out the culture that they had lived in. As you know, since we are not able to go back there and live out the same culture they lived, our thing is educated guess, which means a science. So we do our best science to come closer to the culture they have experienced. So in that way, we'll be able to make a more accurate interpretation of the given text, the Bible. So culture deals with these topics, and it's, you don't talk about it. You don't talk about these elements of the culture, but culture represents it. It talks. So culture is speaking itself to us. Culture tells you about the divinity and spirits. So any culture, whether in the world, whether they are so-called primitive or developed or is urban or rural, all the cultures that they do deal with the topic of divinity and spirits. Some say there is no God. That's also when someone says there's no God, he or she is making expression about divinity. So divinity is one of the major core topic of culture. The language, everyone speaks a language, and there are thousand different languages, which means there are thousand different cultures, because language is one major element that identifies a culture. When you speak a different language, that means almost automatically that they have a different culture. So the language is a key on culture, and it is important because the Bible is written in a certain language or languages, and it is important to understand what that language enhances a certain culture, because the way of speaking, way of talking, way of addressing a person, or way of making the conversation that are different from one to another. So the language is a key in understanding a culture. Then food. Bible includes many discussion about food, and sometimes food has a very significant part in a narrative. For example, Jesus, after his resurrection, comes together with Peter and other disciples near the lake of Galilee, Gennesaret, and they are having the fish, and that fish will have some significant symbolic elements in your interpretation. So the food takes a good part. There are many narratives in the Bible that deals with the element of food. Housing, everyone lives in a house, and some special housing is very important. For example, the temple is a kind of housing, and it acts as key elements in understanding biblical text. The dressing, for example, there is like a very lengthy description of how a priest in a Jewish tradition should dress up, and each dress, the colors and the shape and the material they do have some symbolic elements in it. So you need to understand those symbolic elements of the way of their dressing. Sometimes those dressing will be an important key or clue to understanding the text. Marriage, yeah, that's one of the key elements, because, for example, Jesus talked about marriage, and he gives an example, and he teaches his disciples and saying, I'm the bridegroom and you guys are bride. So, the marriage is universal, but the significance of the marriage and the marriage ceremony and the relationship they understand is different from one culture to the other. So when Jesus talked about himself as a bridegroom, you need to understand the culture. When Jesus was walking on, how the marriage culture was, how the marriage symbolized. Marriage is a very key elements and core elements in Jewish culture, and it includes very important symbolic meanings. So you need to understand those. So marriage, again, as a cultural element, is important in understanding and interpreting the text in the Bible. The gender issue, yeah. The gender understanding today is quite different from the gender understanding a few thousand years ago. Gender understanding of a Middle Eastern culture. In that culture, Arabic and Jewish culture, the gender is perceived very differently. And the biblical text, to your surprise, is quite different from the general cultural perception of gender. So there's quite contrast in the biblical text. As you read them, there is some very different perspectives on the gender to the culture they usually have. For example, in the genealogy, there is a 14 times 3, 14, 14, and 14 generation of genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew, at the very first chapter, the beginning. And out of those, they mention like 5 different women, which usually you do not include in the genealogy. For example, the Korean has those ancestry books, and usually they do not include the ladies in the genealogy. Same thing with the Judaic tradition. So gender is important in understanding the text of Bible. Class. Today we in this capitalistic context that we live in, we are classified by the amount of wealth that you possess. The wealth usually means the power. But in the old days, there wasn't so. Even though there's some aspect of wealth meaning power, but there were born class. You are born into a certain class, and automatically by birth, your position is elected, as given. So you're born as a slave, and you are slave for life. If you're born as a prince of a royal family, you are guaranteed to inherit that throne and become a king. So these are classes that we are talking about in the old days. because of that, people perceive the life differently, and they act differently, and they live a different life. So you need to understand how these class things, impacted their lives. And in the Bible, especially in the Gospel, when Jesus gives those parables, there are parables of slave and stewards and the workers, which are different classes. There is a story of a king, and there is a story of father and son. And father and son, they probably identify as a same social class rank, but father and son has a different rank within the family. So that those kind of class and authorities at the level of power are important in understanding the biblical text. That's why we need to see culture as context. So when we talk about this contextualization, meaning that you are trying to go back to that given culture in the Bible at the given age, at the given time and given area, the whether it's a province, local, the nation, you try to go back to that context, cultural context, as much as possible. It includes upbringing, it includes the birth, it includes the sex, meaning the sex between man and woman, because there are some sexual elements in the Bible. Sometimes it's very detailed sexual acts written in the Bible even. So that becomes also one of elements. You may not think the Bible includes those, but it does. Death and funeral. The way of understanding about the death is much different from our understanding of death today. So in their culture, death means something very different from how the modern people or how some other cultures understands about that. So without knowing how these people, the Jews and the Romans and those people in the time of Jesus understood death, you're not going to be able to get the true sense of the given passage about death and the life. So it is important to understand how they perceived the death in the time of Jesus or time of Abraham, which it will be much different again. Wealth and poverty, they understood the reason of wealth and reason of poverty quite different from us. So if you try to impose your understanding of poverty and wealth, or the why this wealth and poverty happens, then you are going to misinterpret the Bible, and that this thing happens a lot. So the rich and the poor, the definition of rich and poor might be same, but how they perceive about the rich people and why they become rich, and about the poor people and why they become poor, it is different. So quite different interpretation to the same situation or same kind of subject. Nature. The way we understand the nature today, animals, plants, and the natural disaster will be much different. In the ancient days, in the time of Bible, the disaster, it always had some spiritual significance. They had meaning. If you read the book of Job, it does tell you why these tornadoes and sudden death happens to a given family, which is different interpretation than ours today. We just think it's a nature, act of nature, but still many say it's an act of God, the natural disaster. So there are two different perspectives on understanding the nature. And many people today believe nature is evolved itself and by itself, and the animal and plants kind of was evolved from tiny amino acid, and which is a too much jump to the conclusion. So that compared to that, most the ancient cultures believed the nature was created. Animals and people and the plants, fishes, birds, they are all created by someone who has the mighty power. So that would be a very different perspective on understanding the nature. I talked about disasters and happiness. Happiness that you define today or in your culture may be quite different from the definition of happiness in the Bible. So if you use the same kind of understanding of your cultural understanding of happiness to understand the biblical happiness, then you are in the verge of making a very terrible misinterpretation of Bible. And this happens a lot. Same thing with the blessings. Blessing is a major core element of happiness. And the blessing, that way you understand in your culture, the blessing in Chinese culture or Korean culture is quite different. It's totally different from the blessing that is in the Bible. And the problem is today, Koreans and Chinese, they try to understand the biblical term, biblical blessing, just same as their understanding of blessing, which leads to terrible misinterpretation of biblical text. Emotions. The way a certain culture deals with the emotion is quite different from this culture to another. For example, until recently, about 100 years ago in Korea, in Joseon dynasty, which mainly ruled by the Confucius idea from China. And China had, I believe, same thing. They believed in that system. And it says, your emotion should not be expressed, especially if you're a woman, that's more limited. And the man should not cry in front of other people. That's a kind of male thing. And these things, there are many of these things regarding the emotions. So generally speaking, in the Korean culture and the Chinese culture, as far as I know, the emotions were suppressed, and you're not supposed to express your emotions. So that would be quite different from the biblical culture that we face. Some of it is very similar. The Jewish culture seems like they suppress emotions to a certain level, but not the same level as we have experienced in my culture. So that is a different kind of perspective on the emotions. Relationships will be this is something that will be quite different from one culture to the other. So the context, the relationship, way you understand or I understand the relationship, and if you go into the Bible has a very different way of relating among themselves. So man and woman, they had a different set of rules about the relationship, and the brothers, they had a different set of rules for their relationship than ours, and father, son, same thing. And so the way of relating from one person to the other is quite different from this culture to another. So it is important to know how these people in the Bible has related in their own terms, their own rules. They had certain things they do and they don't in doing their relationship. There are certain taboos that you avoid while you're relating from one to another person. They had a very different relationship toward the Gentiles, Jews. Jews had a very different relationship to the Gentiles, while among the Jews, they had their rules and the so-called laws. But these laws they have, it does not apply to the Gentiles when they relate to them. So evidently the culture in Middle East is probably pretty similar in Asia, but it's very very evident in the Middle East culture that there is a certain weakness that within yourself there are certain laws that apply, but when it comes to other ethnic groups, other races, that good rule does not apply to them. And for example, dealing with the money, you're not supposed to get the interest from other people within Jewish community, but it is okay to get high rate interest to other ethnic people, the Gentile. So that's how they kind of related. And it is important to know, why Jews deal differently with the Gentiles, and the relationship is one of them. And work and labor, the way we understand about the work and the laboring will be quite different from theirs. So to understand the work ethics and how they understand the work, the business, you need to know that their culture. So these are like a cultural context. So you have mainly you have context as a reality and existence. And within that, there's something called a culture. Culture in the center of that context. And within the culture, there's a text. Text is either you or that written text or the message. So text can be many things, but in this diagram, text will be you or your family or your nation, your ethnic group. So that's the text, and that is surrounded by the culture that you created. So text creates the cultural context. And that cultural context is a part of larger context called the reality and the existence. So that's the primary picture of that we are dealing with. So when you are reading the Bible, that means you are going into the text directly, their text, which is translated into your language or my language. So my language might not say the same thing that they meant to say. Again, our text that you given, translated, and have like an English Bible, Chinese Bible, Korean Bible, Japanese Bible. You have a Bible in your own language, but that text may not, usually they do, but may not reflect the same text that was written 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. But the translators do their best to try to make it very correct, accurate into your text. So in doing so, not only you translate the words, you have to translate the culture sometimes. Because something they have in that text, the culture, you may not have in this context. So that your context may change your text. That happens. I'll give you an example in the next quarter when I do the how to interpret the Bible, how to do the biblical exegesis. But this quarter, I'm focusing what is biblical exegesis. So we're trying to kind of get the concepts or the understanding of what the biblical exegesis is. I'm just giving the larger picture. So you go into their text through your text, and in that text, it includes the culture, and it includes how their reality and their existence. So the interpretation is including all this, not just the readings, that sometimes, when you read your own text and just read, probably you have about 50% of interpretation, or at the most 60%. So that another 50% and 40% are lost. It's not there when you just read your text and do not do the interpretation. And you just read, and many times people read without interpretation. So biblical exegesis means not only you read, but you are doing some research and some hard work and hard efforts to understand the culture and the other context. And by doing so, you're getting that lost 40 or 50% of the message. So it is a good thing that we work. Now we go into the topic of text and context dynamics. So how does the text and the context interact? And by understanding these two elements, how they interact, we are going to be able to understand the text better. There are two different texts. So, two texts. Their text and our text. Our text is translated. So you read your Korean Bible, Chinese Bible, Japanese Bible, English Bible. So this is our Bible. That's our text. But they do have their text. The best way to do is to have ability of intertext. Intertext means when and if you are be able to understand both texts, the original text of theirs and my text, you can make a comparison. If you fully know their language, whether it's Greek and the Hebrew, if you know Hebrew and Greek well enough, just like your own birth language, mother tongue, then you are in the situation of intertext. So these are the people who translate the Bible. So the gift, the translation is a gift. It's an art. It's a science. And it's a very gifted talent. I mean, it takes a lot of time and energy and effort to learn another language, right? And you guys are experiencing that. But if you're bilingual or trilingual, if you're perfect bilingual, that means you understand both texts well enough with that culture. So you can be intertextual if you understand the Hebrew as much as you do the Jews, and you understand the Greek as much as those people in Greece, and then you are intertextual. So what we are trying to do is become intertextual. Try to understand both languages, but you don't have time to learn or ability to learn Hebrews and Greeks. That's fine, because many in couple thousand years of period, they've done a lot of research, multiple tons and tons of research on their language, their text. So their texts are studied and studied. So you can use those resources. Okay. These resources now readily available, most of the time free of charge, because many Christians, they work their whole life and they give their whole life in studying these materials. And in spite of doing that, they give it free, because there were some people who have supported financially and with other means for these scholars to study. And they are willing to give this vast knowledge free of charge. So on your smartphone and your web, your online, you can find these materials, and it's vast. It takes a lot of time to do it if you're doing it yourself, but they've already done it. It just takes a couple clicks to reach those vast, good quality knowledge. So they already done their study on the text and it's readily available. And most of the time free of charge. It's free. So for these days, 30, 40 years ago, we have to buy those thick books. And it costed a lot. And those books were expensive. But nowadays, if you have a smartphone, it's there, free most of the time. And you can use it much faster than. We had to go to the library and sit down, take the book and sit down and flip the pages to find certain words, the meaning of the word. But these days, you just make it lock and click it, and then there it is automatically. Very easy. So again, going back, at least we are going to deal with 2 or more texts. If you are able to read and write and understand English and your own language, and then those original language, then you are much better. If you can speak, understand Spanish and English, and then your language, if you can read those 3 Bibles, then you're much better. So, these are their texts. Originally written, Old Testaments are written in the Hebrew language. The Hebrew language, they only have consonants. They don't have vowels. So, you have to kind of guess the vowels. But, if you're born there, and if you're a Jew, and if you have studied, learned Hebrew text, you have no trouble in understanding the passage. There's no way that you can confuse, because there's certain, the context, you're reading this out of context. So that's the Hebrew alphabet. And this is their text, which is, again, this is a Greek alphabet. And so, these are their texts. And let's see. This is, I think it's Genesis. Yeah. It's Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. It says, God, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So, that's their language. And our language, English says, Elohim as a created. Elohim created the beginning in the earth and the heavens. That's how the original language were ordered, but in English it's different. And this is a Korean text. So 2 texts. Now we have 2 different contexts. This is our context that we are living in. And when we say our context, it's not just one, but it could be different. Your context and my context are different, even though we live in the same age, in the same America, because our cultural upbringing is different if you're not born here. Even if you are born here, we call ABC. You know that, American born Chinese, right? Or Korean American who are born here. They are not the same as a white American or black American. So they have different culture, different context. The way the Afro-American or Black American are raised is quite different from those urban. suburban white American has been raised. They different in two different worlds, even though they live in the same nation called Great America. For some people, America is not so great. That's reality. See, the existence for Asian Americans are different from the existence of Latino Americans. So in this country, even within Southern California alone, there are very different contexts. So from those contexts, you're trying to come to this context in the Bible. So there's their context and there's our context. And they're inter-context, which is not that possible. If you're a multicultural person, born into a multicultural family, for example, your father is a Latino and your mom is an Asian, then you may live in a two different culture and being raised in two culture at the same time. So that's bicultural. And then you are more intercontextual. But the way we try to do it is your context and their context in the Bible. You're trying to understand that context from your context, which is not that easy and simple. So it takes a lot of effort and study and time. And fortunately, and that too, scholars have studied their context. Even though my context and your context may be different from theirs and different from one another, these things, the Hebrew context and the Greek Roman context that Jesus was in as a person of a colony of Roman Empire, having the Greco-Roman cultural background with the Jewish culture. So Jesus was basically intercultural, whether he wanted to or not. So the scholars, they have studied and given much time in trying to understand their context. So where do we go for that? Again, go to resources, the books, their writings, and then dictionaries. These are the resources that we rely on to understand their context. So we can discuss that further as we go to the next quarter for how to do the interpretation. But today we'll limit our discussion to here. The thing is, the culture and the context, text, even though there are significant differences, yet there are significant commonality. Commonality meaning something that is same. People get to born, people get to eat, and people get to have a house. They have to have something to dress, and they get married, and they worry about the life and death. They have issues of sickness, and they have issues of hate, and the fight, and division, and these things happen in all the cultures, in spite of different texts and context. And they have basic needs, and There's a general humanity that has been embedded in our heart. Trying to be a good person. And the conscience was embedded in us by God. And every normal person, not the crazy ones, but every normal person, the common person, common people, they have something called humanity, which we also find in the text and the context of Bible. So that you can identify easily and readily. You don't need to study it. You don't need to do the research it. You don't need to rely on the resources for this. You know what the hunger is. And you know what the sickness feels like. You know what the loneliness can do to a human being. So these are all common, universal to everyone. It's general. But with these same things, I mean, you can go on and on the list of this commonality, but there are differences, worldviews, the way you see the reality and existence and interpret it and promote and work out, behave. The worldview drives you. Worldview decides how you should behave. So your behavior is controlled by that worldview. And the thing is, in spite of these commonalities, people have different way of interpreting the reality that is around you. So that's worldview. Narratives. Your narratives is quite different from mine. Not only individually, but culturally and nationally. If you're born and raised in China, it will be different from even if you're in my age. The way I grew up in Korea will be quite different from the way you grew up in China. So we do not share the same narratives. That's a quite difference. It's a distinctiveness and it's uniqueness, and that raises a possibility of misunderstanding and misinterpretation. Same thing happens when we try to go back to the biblical text and biblical context, because we do not share the same narrative. The way you interpret depends largely on your narrative. People come with their own narrative and try to understand the narrative in the Bible, and because of that, there's going to be much misinterpretation or wrong interpretation. Your narrative or my narrative that you have experienced years and years, or maybe 20, 30 years or 60 years, that is going to affect the way you read and understand their narrative. So best way is to find the common narrative that you share with the narratives in the Bible. Surprisingly, because we are the same human being, much of the narratives that you find in the Bible, the narratives Adam and Eve, or Abraham, or Jacob, or even Jesus had experienced, you'll find something that's common, that you can identify with in that narrative. So the art of the biblical exegesis or interpretation of Bible is to try to match your narrative and find the common narrative in the Bible and learn the lesson from those narratives and bring it into your narrative. So narrative is not only the past, it is the present and the future. You have a future and present narrative that's going on at this very moment, at this very place. And it will continue to go on into the future. And you also have your narrative that's behind you, that has created and influenced you. And the interpretation, it has to do mainly with these narratives. So that's the key elements. So within the differences, try to find the common narrative, and that's what the biblical exegesis is. Environments. You grow up in different environments. Okay, there's something called form and meaning. That form and meaning is kind of similar to the text and context, but it's at a different level. Form is, definition of form is vessel. Vessel is what contains, while the meaning will be water. So if you put the water in the vessel for dog food, and it becomes dog water, right? Or cat water. But if you put that water in the golden cup or golden vessel, then water becomes golden. So form, if you put the water in the rectangular shaped vessel, the water becomes rectangular. If you put the water in the round vessel, and then water shapes the round. But it's the same water, but with a different container. So form and the meaning. The meaning, the message. The Bible has the meaning and message. That's the text. So whether it's our text or their text, these texts has the form and the culture also has the form and meaning. For example, what will become? Okay, you know pastors. The pastors, when they come to Sunday worship, they dress up in their so-called robe. It's a long dress with a button up, and usually it's black with some stripes on. That means authority, and it means formality. So I'm not wearing a formal dress. This will be casual or informal. But if I think this is something that is formal, probably I'll wear the suit with the tie and white shirts, and then wear the different kind of shoes. So that means with the forms, the way of dressing, it is saying, okay, this is a formal thing. So when you go to a wedding ceremony, that you try to wear formal. Meaning, okay, I'm showing my respect. So that's the way of dressing is formal. If you go to a funeral, you don't want to wear something that's bright or colorful. Usually you wear either white or black, or white. That means I'm showing my condolence and my respect to the dead. So those are like in the cultural forms and cultural meaning. And the context also may have some form and meaning. So those are the examples of forms and meanings. And in the Bible, as you try to understand biblical text and biblical culture, as you go into this, there are things that is in the formal form, and there are things that reflect the meaning. So what we are trying to do is trying to go into the form of text. Text, the writing, the letter, the words, document is a form. It's a form. And in that form, in that record, it contains the meaning. So first thing is trying to find the meaning from the text. But you're trying to also find the deeper meaning within the cultural forms. And then also cultural context. So these things kind of go together. So when we try to make an interpretation of Bible, what we are doing is trying to do this to see the form, and then what does this form reflect a certain meaning and the message. And for example, the cross. Jesus died on the cross, and that cross is a form. But today, that cross has a lot of meanings contained in it. It means the redemption. It means salvation. It means the death. It means your sin is nailed on the cross. So these meanings are interpreted by Paul and Peter and some other disciples, and those are written in the Bible. So actually they saw the symbol and the form and interpreted that into the meaning. So blood is another form, and the blood has quite different significant and important meanings in the Bible. So there is always that form and symbol and the meaning and the message. So it is quite important to know about the form and meanings, how they relate to one another. So this concludes the lesson 4 about the biblical exegesis as a contextualization, and we are going to meet you again in the next class, and we'll continue with the biblical exegesis as an interpretation. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.